Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi dan selamat pagi juga kepada Prof. Dr. Bart. Masa saya jumpa dulu dia belum Prof lagi ya. Dah 11 tahun 2014 nanti we met. So luckily dia masih ingat lagi lah. Alhamdulillah.
Masih.
Okey, saya berbahasa Inggeris sebab dia akan berbahasa Inggeris lepas ni. Okey, saya introduce dulu lah. Saya rasa ramai yang kenal Prof. Bart ya. Dia orang panggil dia Pak Bart. Sebab selalu di Indonesia ya Pak ya. Okey, untuk yang tak mengenali lagi Prof. Bart, Prof. Bart Barendregt ini adalah seorang Profesor of Digital Anthropology at Leiden University, Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Sociology. Seorang anthropologist dan seorang sociologist, and holds the UNESCO Chair on the Anthropology of Digital Diversity. Yeah. And he currently serves as Vice Dean for Research and Dean of the Graduate School of Leiden's Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Okay, Bart's work explores how people use technology to give meaning to their worlds with a special focus on Muslim Southeast Asia. Since the early 1990s, he has conducted extensive fieldwork in Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore. Saya rasa ramai yang kenal yang dah jadi telah ditemu bual oleh Pak Bart ya, di Malaysia ni. And intersections of Islam, media and modernity. His research moves between the study of religious life, popular culture and new digital forms of communication and creativity. He leads the NWO-VICI project One Among Zeroes towards an anthropology of everyday AI in Islam. Okay, sekarang ni AI is a buzzword, which examines how Muslim communities imagine and use artificial intelligence in daily life. Earlier, Bart co-directed the Articulation of Modernity project, which explored Southeast Asia's musical modernities and the ways sound, faith, and media technologies have shaped social change. His publications include Sonic Modernities in the Malay World. Buku ni kena ya. Siapa yang kaji tentang dunia Melayu ni kena beli buku ni ya. Female Voices of Asian Modernities and Banal Beats Muted Histories. His forthcoming book studies Islamist musicians and digital proselytizing in the age of AI. Okay, I think that's spot on betul baik. Okay, tanpa membuang masa saya serahkan kepada Prof. Dr. Bart untuk present his keynote speech. Ya, silakan Pak Bart.
Thanks, Raja Iskander, for a very nice introduction and good reconnecting. And good to see a lot of familiar faces in the room. Makes me feel a little bit nervous and intimidated as well, to be honest, but I will do my best. Good morning. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Goedemorgen, as we say. Goedemorgen. Maybe a few things first, like it's very good to be... Let's check. Is this better? Can you hear me? That's cukup jelas? Okay. It's good to be back in Malaysia. It's good to be back in Ipoh. And for me, it's like almost 12, 13 years ago when I first started working on Nasyid. I know a lot of people in this room. I met some people last night. I'm very sorry that I missed the first session because we were in a jam from KL. But I understood that you talked a lot about AI, something that I'm very much interested in as well. And again, it's good to reconnect. It's nice to see so many of you still thriving. And Nasyid is still very much alive, I would say. Saya juga harus minta maaf. Karena saya akan bicaranya dengan bahasa Inggrisnya. Kalau bahasa Indonesia bisanya sedikit, tapi selamanya 40 menit saya nggak berani, saya rasanya. Tapi itu berarti kalau ada sesuatu yang kurang jelas atau susah dipahami, tolong, kalau bahasa Malaysia boleh, bahasa Indonesia boleh juga, bahasa Belanda silakan kalau mau, tapi digaduh-gaduhkan aja. But I will be using English, and I'm going to talk using this title, Nasyid for the record, a short history, and let's take 40 minutes or so, of the Asia's most popular Islamic music genre in 7 technologies. So I will be talking a lot about technology. As Ratja Iskander already introduced, I'm a digital anthropologist, mostly looking at what digital technology is doing with culture. But I will say more about that in a minute. Let's talk about the big elephant in the room. And let's start from there. I know that last night some of you were involved in a session on AI-generated music. That's the thing that I'm interested in, and that I want to talk a little bit about. Of course, I felt very tempted when I was first invited to the conference, and big thanks to EMS for inviting me and having me over here. What if I were to do a Nasyid myself on this particular symposium, using AI, of course, not it's an easy thing, a lot of us do. I know that some of my friends here in the room are using Zuno, which is one very popular app. But I thought, like, what if I did a Nasyid on the use of AI itself? And have the machine reflect on itself a little bit and what it would sound like. And it was very easily done. And you basically in ChatGPT say, like, can you make me a Malay pantun, AB, rhyme scheme, on how Nasyid has survived technology throughout the times. And it made me a short lyric. I'm not sure if you can read it in the back of the room, which is reasonable, it's decent, it's not so bad. And which you next put in Zuno, and then you ask, please, can you do me something harmonious, a cappella, something Nasyid-like, something Malayu. And it's decent, I would say, as well. Let's see if we can play it. Can't see my pointer, I think. Now. And otherwise we skip it, not so. Ya, kalau play lagunya yang ada di situ. Kalau nggak apa-apa juga, kan kita teruskan aja. It's just trying to offend you here in the room, provoke you, and see where we can take it from there. Biar nggak apa-apa. I will play it later on after the session, and you will hear.
You have the file.
Oh, yeah, we have. Yeah, but we can do later on, not so. In any case, like I made a song through Suno and it sounded quite decent. Almost like a Nasyid. If you're not familiar, if you're from the Netherlands and you don't hear a Nasyid too often, you think like, ah, it could be Malayu. It could be Nasyid. But I can understand this causes a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety among people who are into the business of doing Nasyid. If you're a composer and you see like, hey, in 1 single second, somebody can do a Malaysian pantun, mengenakan, you need to eat from somewhere, and this is seriously competition, I would say. And the same for music, of course. So that's the thing that I want to talk about. It's very understandable. There's a lot of anxiety around AI. At the same time, it's nothing new, I would say. But there are different histories about fear for technology. I would say every new technology that comes into the music industry has caused similar anxieties, similar worries. And it would be good to look a little bit back at those anxieties and tell a whole history of loss, as some people would say. Setiap ada teknologi baru, ada sesuatu yang ketinggalan, yang kita nggak bisa lagi. It can be a disembodiment. Hey, we record through a gramophone, the voice is no longer in the product, but it's somewhere else. It can be the loss of spirituality, as a lot of people are now saying. And as an anthropologist, I'm very interested in that notion. Hey, what is it we think, we fear that we are losing? Now, these are the kind of questions that people are typically asking. Is this the death of the author? Is this the end of the penyanyi, the composer, the lyricist? Could be. I don't think so. I'm more positive, I can tell you. Is this even Islamic? I remember that, for example, the first time we had video CDs, a lot of times you could read on the label, jangan bacakan, itu haram, even on Nasyid CDs. Not so we have been there, we know what it's like. People are fearing that something is being stolen from us. And of course, there is no spirit in the machine. And you can do like a Nasyid in 20 seconds, like I did, tapi nggak ada niat. There is no intention there. It's very different. It's what people are normally fearing, I would say. So that's one story you can tell, a story of loss, which is a very pessimistic story, I would say, a grim story, which I don't like to tell. There's different things you can do. Now, there are other stories you can tell as well, and I have to warn you, I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists study the way we become human through culture. How we relate to our fellow people because we are doing culture, we are doing cultural values, we build our own societies, and we work culturally with each other. Now, I'm a digital anthropologist. So I'm looking at how people become human by using digital technologies. Do we become less social, more social, because we use social media? Does it impact our way of being humans in this world because we rely on certain technologies? Those are the questions I'm interested in, and we as anthropologists would say if you're talking about religion, religion on record, and religion through recording technologies, that's nothing new. In fact, all religion, all faith has always been necessarily so mediated. And like we can only think about religion as something mystical out there that we can't see, and it is the big mystery, through doing it through mediums. And some religions choose to do that through patung, statues. I think a Ganesha statue. United States radio. And the big success of, I would say, Christianity in the United States was tele-evangelism and radio evangelism using media technology. There's other forms as well, newer forms. I gave here the example of Instagram, the hijabbers movement in Indonesia, for example. Here is yet another form. You can look closer to home, even like a tasbih that you're using is a form of media, an object through which you relate to something out there. And so for us, there's nothing new as anthropologists in turning to media technology to do your faith, to experience your faith, to relate to a God out there. Which sounds a little bit scholarly, but it's interesting to see what those technologies do to a religion. They impact the way people are working on their religion clearly. At the same time, religious attitudes also tell us something about should we reject a technology, embrace a technology. And so in that sense, it's a dynamic picture. It's not too negative. It's not like, poof, we have a new technology and suddenly we become less religious or more religious. No, we also have something to tell, of course, as religious people ourselves. And I'm interested in that kind of dynamic. What happens between religion on the one hand, faith on the other hand, and how do they interact? Which is never a static picture, I would say. This is the book that Ratja Iskander, for example, was referring to, and I'm not putting it here as a way of self-promotion, but the book is for free, online, gratis. You can read it, and there's quite a lot on Malaysian music there as well, which may be of interest to you. And if this book proves one thing, there's a lot of authors there working on Southeast Asia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all of them say, like, technology is not determining. Take a guitar. Just because people give you a guitar doesn't mean that you only have to play rock and roll. And you can do a lot of things with a guitar. And you can play keroncong as well on a guitar if you want to, or jazz music. And so it's not determining. It's simply because you're given, let's say, AI, you're not going to make a certain kind of music. Yeah, but we're still flexible. We can appropriate, as musicians, what we want to do with a technology. Now, that's the kind of story I want to tell here, and I want to take you on that journey. And what if we were to do like a short history of Nasyid in 7 technologies? And this is completely arbitrary, the 7 technologies. I'm looking at some of the main prominent technologies, shellac discs, radio, AI, streaming media. It easily couldn't have been others as well. But let's try to see what that would produce as a story. So 100 years of faith, experiencing religion, through technology. What would that look like? And what can we learn from that looking at our current age of AI and all the fears and all the anxieties we are currently seeing? It's also another story. And like I want to use this story, history, and several technologies to show like how Nasyid became Nasyid. If I think about Nasyid, for me, it's not only the most beautiful in terms of voice. I know I'm biased. I'm a big fan of Nasyid. Some of you are big fans as well. It's also, I would say, the most commercial, the most modern, the most gendered, the most visual, the most media savvy, and spiritual of Islamic musics we are currently seeing in Southeast Asia. And there's a huge statement, I realize. Again, I'm a little bit biased, I'm a fan. At the same time, I'm going to prove this by showing you how Nasyid has dealt with those 100 years of technology and the technological transformations we have been going through. And I want to start with a technology which some of you maybe don't even consider a technology, but the pre-recorded era, and take you to the era of manuscripts, of hikayat, shair. And there's work by a colleague of Raja Iskander, Jenny McCallum, and they worked in the same project. Jenny McCallum did a very nice project on old Riau manuscripts. She worked on Singapore, but also the Riau archipelago, looking at what she called 19th century Malay sound worlds. And if you're looking at those manuscripts, you already see the world of music. You can read the world of music. Of course, you can't hear it. That's the problem. We don't have a time machine. We can't go back to the 19th century. But still, we learn some of what Islamic music may have sounded like. There was Qasida, there was Bazanji, Talil, Salawat, but also Nasyid is already mentioned. And so it means people were already looking at Nasyids, frame drums accompanying it in that time, back in the 19th century. And so it is a Malay legacy, you could say. What I think is very nice in Jenny's thesis is that she talks a lot about the voice, and what the voice may have sounded like, what the ideal voice would sound like in the 19th century. And she's talking about this concept of the suara merdu, which we still have. And merdu may mean something else back then than it does now. But she has some very interesting things to say, which for me is, I think, the first quality of Nasyid. And the beautiful voice, the stress on the beautiful voice. And a lot of people always pronounce it in a slightly more negative way. That they say like, we are a cappella, because, you know, Arab music, haram, we can't use, apalagi string instruments. And God only has given us like the voice to listen to. But if you look at Malay manuscripts, there's also a more positive approach. And like the suara merdu is like a bridge, a jambatan, between the human and the divine. It's a medium in itself already. It's not only about disciplining that voice. Through years of training, you become a good singer, but you also have to believe what you sing. It's about devotion, it's about niyat, it's about intention again. And I think that's still very recognizable. If I talk with my Nasyid friends today, it's the same thing they're still emphasizing. It's not about what you sing, but about how you would be singing that. And do you really believe what you are singing there? Because people will hear. And so the beautiful voice, back in manuscripts, I would say a very first quality of what makes Nasyid Nasyid. Let's move on. Something that is more recognizable as a media technology, radio. The era of radio, the era of gramophone records, 78 RPMs. And some of you in the audience may still have played those records, I realize. I'm a collector, so I have a lot of these things still at home, and they withstand the test of time. A cassette easily is ruined, but a shellac disc at 78 RPM is very nice to listen to still, I would say. I'm here relying on the work of a scholar from the US, Philip Jampolsky, who did a great book on Dutch East Indies colonial radio. And so radio back in the 1920s, 1930s, and what it may have sounded like. Again, we don't have recordings of Dutch East Indies radio. And we don't know how Indonesians listen to colonial radio, but you can look from the advertising, from the program guides, what more or less was being programmed. And what Philip noticed is that Malay records in Malay language, already existed since 1903. which is very quick, realizing that shellac, the printing of shellac records was only invented in 1895, a few years after commercially released. In 1903, people were already recording music here in Southeast Asia, which is really quick, I would say. Radio was a little bit later, 2 decades later, 1920s, 1930s, radio became really big, and there was this nice interaction between radio and people who recorded gramophone records. In the sense that it's a really expensive exercise to record people. You really need to have talented people, because otherwise you waste a lot of money on it. But the radio was much more experimental. And you could easily call in a new group, a new combo for one evening, have them play on the radio, airwaves. And if it sounded nice, hey, next week we invite you again. If it was not nice, we invite somebody else. And you can't do that with records. And so in that sense, technology was imposing a little bit what was listened to. What was very interesting is that on colonial radio, there was an awful lot of Islamic music, which a lot of people sometimes don't understand. And why would the Orang Belanda main lagu Islam on the radio? Do they even know what people are singing about? It was in Bahasa Arab, and they could hardly imagine. And some of these songs were very much like anti-colonial in sentiment even. Did the Dutch people know? Not. Hardly, I would say. And so what is the reason of playing religious music on the radio? Very simple, one word: capitalism. It's a huge market out there. And what do you do in an archipelago, 1,700 islands, people speaking languages like Sundanese, Minangkabau, Javanese? They all sing their own lagu daerah, but there's one thing that connects them, and that's religious music, Islamic music. So if you want to reach like the largest market out there, you go for religious music, which explains actually why it was so popular, especially gambus. And gambus was a big thing on colonial radio, in Arab mostly. And we see like a network of people, Medan, Palembang, Rio as well, evolving in the 1930s. People specializing in gambus music. There's a lot of gambus being recorded. We also find the first records actually referring to Nasyid in the 1930s. And so it dates quite a while back already. Now, what is interesting, there was hardly any protest here in Southeast Asia by introducing both the radio and the shellac disc. In other areas we see people like complaining, but what do? We can't perform anymore because now it's the radio. Everyone listens to records or the radio, but nope. And people seem to like it. They embraced the technology. It was only a lot of competition between live performers and recorded performers. And because it would bring in a lot of money once you are recorded. So that was the anxiety in those days. Again, second quality, like we had the Suara Merdu as one quality, I would say commercial viability is another thing that has been with recorded Islamic music from the very first days. It meant a large, big market out there. And so even the colonizers saw some potential that you could sell records once you're doing Islamic music. It's also interesting, you notice that also with other technologies that later on emerge, that is this perverse logic between if you have the hardware, and for example radios, you also need the software to sell your radios. And so you need to record musicians, otherwise you don't sell your technology. And that's interesting to compare to some of the other technologies, especially AI, of course, later on. And you can have AI, but to promote AI, you need human creativity. Otherwise, nobody is going to look at it, I would say. And the good news is, it doesn't replace faith. And religion is actually amplified by new technology, as we notice in this particular case. Now, we move very fast forward into the 1950s, 1960s, the birth of the new post-colonial nations, Indonesia, Malaysia, later on Singapore broke away, you know all of that. Interestingly, if you look at 1960s Southeast Asia, yes, there are national companies. It's very much still a Southeast Asian market. And one market out there, satu pasarnya, and people don't care if you record something in Medan, it will be played in Singapore. If you record something in Singapore, it will be played in Kelantan. It's still very open and dynamic. And that took, I think, almost until the 1980s. And nowadays, Southeast Asian music doesn't travel that well anymore. It's maybe Siti Nurhaliza, which is played still in Indonesia, and dangdut music here, but for the rest, there's hardly any exchange. In those times, it was very fluid, you could say. I'm interested in the birth of genres. And now we talk a lot about genre ini, genre itu, rock and roll, jazz, hip hop, you name it. It's something that you actually only see emerge in the 1960s. And a lot of ethnomusicologists, sociologists are always speculating, how come? We think because the social change speeded up so much. People didn't stay in their own particular environment anymore, but people moved to the city, became white-collar workers, start studying. There was this need of identifying yourself. Who are you? What kind of lifestyle are you adhering to? And the market, the industry does feel that and feeds that. And they think like, oh, this is young people, let's give them rock and roll. This is older people, let's give them something jazzy or conjong. And so the market can play around with it. And you see that very much happening in Islamic music as well. And before, everything was almost gambus. Then you had qasida, which was mostly the vocal accompaniment of songs. Interestingly, we also saw the shift from qasida being sung in Arab into Bahasa Melayu, which in the 1960s really happened, that they all shifted to singing in local languages, no longer in Arab anymore. And we see a very quick change of genres following each other, like maybe in an interval of 2-3 years. And once it's called Orkes Gambus, then it becomes Orkes Padang Pasir, then it becomes qasida, qasida modern, qasida nasyid, nasyid modern, nashida we saw for some time. And then it seems that nasyid became very dominant as a term for referring to Islamic music. And it still contains all those elements. There's still qasida singing, there's still gambus music, but nasyid became the sole label that really was dominant in the industry. Now, one of the groups that was very influential, and a lot of you may have been growing up with this music, Orkes Al Suraya, from Medan, originally from Medan. It's a group which became big in the 1950s already. Ahmed Baki, the composer, you see him here up. A very famous man in most of Southeast Asia, very little known in Europe, unfortunately, I would say. Very gifted, great musician, who started out as an Orkes Gambus, then did Padang Pasir music, and then ended up doing nasyid music as well. I think Orkes Al Suraya in a lot of ways is very interesting. I think you could really literally say like this is the very first group that really made like bestsellers, pop music, which was played on the radio, recognized as such, alternating compositions. And like one day they came with this singer, another day with another singer, but they were very well known. They had a following. And they traveled the whole of Southeast Asia, did festivals, went to schools. So very interesting, I would say the very first example in which nasyid really gets into the pop industry. Now, most of you probably have heard this song, Selimut Putih. I think that's by far the most well-known song by Orkes Al Suraya. Little of you may know that this song was being banned from radio television Malaysia for some time as well. Anyone has an idea why Selimut Putih was banned? Too scary. People were listening to the lyrics and thought like, ooh, all this singing about, ooh, the archangel, me standing there in front of the archangel, my body decomposing, ooh, stinking, rotting. It was very scary for a lot of people. And to be confronted so much with their own life, death, and everything, that the radio thought it was not appropriate to put it on the airwaves. Ironically, it was in very good company. I think only Elton John and Tamil music was banned from the air in that same year. Tamil music because it was considered too sexy, Elton John because it was too gayish, and then this because it was too morbid, too scary. So very weird. If you look at Berita Harian from those years, and this was in 1974, there's a lot of discussion about this, especially housewives sending in letters to the newspaper saying like, tolong, jangan dilarangnya. I need this record because I have to teach my husband not to gamble and not to look at other women because you know what awaits for him. And so it was actually women saying like, we need this back on air. And there was so much protest that in the end Selimut Putih was being played again. It took a while, it took a controversy, it's there. Interestingly, once it was on air again, I think this was the only period in Malaysian history that was this very short-lived government of UMNO and PAS together, and the PAS youth minister said like, hey, but this Orkes Al Soraya, that's exemplary. We need them. They are good role models. Let's send them into the Velda villages and educate the Muslim masses and to show what morality is. Now, that's very interesting for me. Al Soraya is actually like illustrating the third characteristic of Nasyid, how to deal with modernity. Here we're looking at 1960s, 70s Malaysia, very quickly dibangun. It's the times of Mahathir emerging later on as well. There's a lot of stress on the new economic policy. Nice being modern, nice being developed. But bagaimana tentang roh kita? Are we feeling more happy, more spiritual because of all these developments? And I think Nasyid has been particularly good in addressing those questions. How to deal with the modern. And hence I call it a modern genre. I didn't know it was there, sorry. So, a bit loud. What Al Soraya for me also shows is like the tremendous power of the female voice, which is something that we typically see becoming really big in 1950s, 1960s, probably for the reason of this, the microphone. And for a long time, women have been on stage in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. But people said, it's always very difficult if women are not amplified, they have to shout. That looks a kind of rude, it's not nice. It doesn't fit their gender role, you could say. And the microphone changed much of that. You could be intimate in a public setting, talk softly. It sounds a bit simplistic, but it's a reason why suddenly women became big on stage as well. Also because they addressed female issues, and there was a big audience out there. 50% happened to be women. And so you want to incorporate that as well. Now, what we see in the early 1970s is something very interesting. It's Nasyid, but it's all female Nasyid, which is emerging. And I know there's a lot of these records out there, CDs, which are often referring to Nasyid Evergreen, Al Jawahir, Al Mizan, those group. But believe me, in the 1970s, Nasyid was female. It was a female era. And that's very interesting to see because later on, of course, this totally got inverted. It was a man's thing. It was mostly men on stage, boy band image most of the time. But it started out as something else in that time. Why? Very simple. Nasyid was not mainstream yet, but because of Orkes Al Soraya and similar groups, it was often played on the radio. Close to Sholat Maghrib, you could hear Nasyid. It was very, I would say, not boring Nasyid, but very much like imposed to like, hey, you have to do it like this. A lot of aturan from Yakim, how to do Nasyid. Not the kind of Nasyid as we know it now. But a lot of women like to tune in. Again, with this idea like, hey, this domestic devotion. We need to teach our husband, our kids, not to be nasty, not to be naughty. Ingat, listen to Nasyid, close to Maghrib. So the industry was aware that there is this huge following, women listening to Nasyid, and thought like, hey, but if they are listeners, why not turn them into performers as well? This may work. It's a miracle it took them so long to find it out, but in the 1970s, a lot of companies suddenly thought, EMI, Warner Brothers, let's do female Islamic music. This is the greatest example, I think the best known example. Unfortunately, they are not from Malaysia, but from neighboring Singapore, Al Mizan. Some of you may know the story that in 1977, Farida Muhammad, only 16 or 17 years old, still a school kid then, was being signed by Warner Brothers as a pop artist because of her suara merdu. And she looked nice, she had a good voice. Afterwards, she writes that she didn't feel very comfortable because she rather would like to be a Nasyid singer. But she recorded a pop album, was a kind of successful, but not really the thing she wanted to do. 1 year later, it was Al Mizan, a group brought together young women, students, Farida as the main singer. He first recorded an EP, immediately gained itself a gold record as an award. Quite special, I would say, for those days. A Nasyid record who make it gold. And the subsequent 2 albums all went gold as well. I don't know about the sales nowadays, but 50,000 kaping, that's quite a lot, I would say, for those days as well. How many of you have been listening to Al Mizan? Can I see some hands? Not a lot, but it's worthwhile listening. Eh? Like if you listen, like the lyrics are very much about virtue, faith, domestic affairs. I don't expect a lot of activism there, I would say, but there was a huge audience out there for these kind of things. And I would say for me, it represents the 4th typical feature of Nasyid. It's gendered. And I realized that there's a fine line here, because afterwards there comes this whole discussion, especially at the times of the Islamic awakening, should women be standing on stage? What about the awrat? What if they sing together in mixed combos? Let's not go there. So that became a big thing within Nasyid, the gender dimension. And it's ironic to realize because it owes so much to women performing Nasyid on stage first. And I think it's nice. It's a very gendered genre, and it's good to realize. And maybe also good to point out that it was not only Singapore and Malaysia, but also in Indonesia, a lot of Nasyid was being done by female comrades. Nasyidaria, maybe a group that is well known here, from Sumatra. And I think they're nice to mention because they did a lot of political songs as well. They did songs like Bom Atom, singing about the Cold War era, nuclear energy, those kind of things. So it was not only domestic things, other things were happening as well. And which is also a nice bridge to my next technology, my next slide, which is about cassette activism. And a little bit of a context here, I realize there's people in the room, we're getting closer in time, that have very well experienced this era, and I don't have to explain. But we have this new emergent Muslim middle class. It's the new economic policy, the heydays of it, but also noticing that they're losing out on something. And they want to stick to their Malay religious style. They came from the village, not yet arrived in the village or in the city. They're stuck somewhere in between. So they need a lifestyle which is morally inflicted, which comes with Islamic ethics. It's also the era of the Kebangkitan Islam, the Islamic awakening. And most typically, of course, the days of Arkam, Dahu Arkam. Some of you may recognize Sungai Penchala here. It still looks very much like this, I think, nowadays. Al-Arkam, Ashari Muhammad, who started with a revivalist movement, very much focusing on economy. And that's interesting, because a lot of people always run to politics, but I think in the first place it was very much an economic movement and a spiritual movement. And we often tend to forget that. I also think that we here see the very beginning of what we nowadays call the halal economy. And the whole craze of halal certification, halal goods, and we owe that to Arkam, of course, I would say. Now, why is this interesting in terms of technology? This era happens to coincide with cassettes, the cassette revolution. And if there's one thing you can say about cassettes worldwide, cassettes, because they were so cheap, a record, it costs you a lot of money to invest and to record, but the cassettes, you just record 500 pieces, and if they don't work, you re-record them. You can wipe them and do something else on them. So it's very cheap, it's very portable, you can exchange. It's a much more flexible genre or format than all of the previous technologies. It's also, I think, a genre because of its cheapness and flexibility that enabled a lot of genres that hitherto were not possible. Indigenous music, ethnic music, religious music as well. And not even like the big world religions, Christianity or Islam, but a lot of smaller religions as well, which benefited from this. Now, you can imagine that if you're Al-Arkam, you have a message to send to the world that is not maybe totally mainstream yet. Cassette is a perfect medium for that. And I would say that's why Nasyid in those days perfectly collided, perfectly aligned with that new technology. Audio, video, Al-Arkam, OVA records. Some of you may remember those cassettes which circulated. There's lots of them. They're still around, maybe. Some of them are re-recorded again, of course, some of the Lagu as well. But the whole idea that you can bring those records, give them to your friends, like, hey, look, there's this new spiritual message, listen to it, the cassette helped very much with it. It was not determining it, but afforded at least the means to do that kind of thing. Now, we all know the story. Banned in 1994, music continued. I think some of the musicians are still with us here today, of course. There's Gabani, Hijaz, Raihan. I think it very much set the stage also for what was to come in the years after. And people lost sight of Dawa Arkham, but Nasyid went overground. And that's the big irony of Arkham, that politically maybe they may not have been so successful. Culturally, paf, it's very much in your face. It's a big success, you could say. Which brings me to this, which you probably all recognize. Like the big going mainstream of Nasyid, 1997, Raihan's Puji Pujian. Interestingly, I checked yesterday, still Malaysia's best-selling album to date. A Nasyid album, so tepuk tangan, I would say. That. Yeah, it's impressive. And I think very interesting, I was in Indonesia in those days. It was really big in Indonesia as well, especially during Ramadan. Every hour of the day, Raihan was being played. Even in the Netherlands, it was played on the radio, which is exceptional. Not any Nasyid record made it that big until so far. So it went global, it went mainstream. For me, very important, it also went very visual. It was very, nicely, well produced. And musically, absolutely perfect. It was Farihin, who was the creative mastermind from Zikr times, and that was all perfectly okay. But especially the visual dimension, that's something new that Raihan really brought to stage, I think. White robes, smiles, and the friendly face of Islam. People outside would say, like, oh, you see, those Muslims from Malaysia, they're very friendly people. They have Raihan. And so even Queen Elizabeth invited them. Now, you know the story. I think it also very much sets the stage what comes afterwards. And some of you may recognize Imam Muda, the reality shows. I think a lot of Islam's visual culture was very much determined by that very first album, Puji Pujian. So Islam becomes visual. Why? I think mostly the video CD, which for me is like a kind of intermediate between, on the one hand, the cassette, the music, but then later on the internet, which was slowly emerging. But we had the short era in which video CDs were the hype of the day. Everyone was doing video CDs. Everyone was doing karaoke as well. I think many of you who are younger, you will still hafal dua puluh lima rasul because of Raihan, the karaoke CD. That's what it did. It was very educational. You could see it and enjoy it in that way. Some of you still may remember the film, the very first Islamic science fiction film. It was sold back then, Syukur 21, also with Yasin of Brothers in it as well. And the Raihan Rangers. I remember visiting some of Raihan concerts and my young daughter, 4 or 5 years, donning her Raihan Rangers t-shirt very proudly. And showing that there's role models within Islam, within Nasyid, all very much in your face, very visual. So the fifth quality, Nasyid is very visual, has become very visual. It has become fashionable as well. It's all about not only what you sing, but also how you perform on stage, and sets the tone for a lot what comes later on. Reality shows, TV shows, academic fantasia, in which Nasyid stars make it big. So all trend-setting there. And then we are moving close to home. The campus revival, the Nasyid revival, early 2000s. There's a lot of groups. I can only mention so few, and not too many. I think this is the most well-known, Intim, UNIC, Mestika, and we're talking about that generation, Saujana and the like. But this slow move from a Dawah movement that Al-Arkam was to the campus. And suddenly each of the universities seemed to have a kumpulan itself. And like you go to, there's this campus contest, there's inter-university contests. It was all very much a campus thing, I think. Also very big on campus radio. If you're talking about technologies, we shouldn't be forgetting to mention that as well. I think it's also interesting in that respect because it was an increasingly younger audience that Nasyid was catering to. The 1970s, mostly housewives. It doesn't sound too nice, but you know what I mean, housewives. Al-Arkam, that was more grown-ups. People who want to change the world economically, spiritually. But this was aimed at students, a young generation. And suddenly Nasyid became a very fashionable thing as well. And later on we start calling this like young people that want to go hijrah. I think the term was not being used at that time yet, but now everyone talks hijrah. I would say this is the start of hijrah, the hijrah movement, which you now see all over Southeast Asia. Very interesting also the success of social media, I would say. And we're talking 2004, 2005, the rise of Facebook, Friendster, MySpace. Some of you may still remember. Other people think like, oh, Yadur, that's a long time ago. I don't know what he's talking about. We have TikTok and Insta now. Yeah, but we have had other social media platforms, of course. And I would say it's nice to see how these Nasyid revivalists really become digital entrepreneurs, which is adding yet another dimension to what Nasyid music is. The whole interactive relation with your fans, building it up, a huge fan base through Facebook, through YouTube, doing things together as well, which I think is really important as well. Now, in-team records, I just had to take one Chonto, one example. I think they're probably by far the most prolific. But you know the story, Kasi Kakasi, a big romantic hit. I learned that they just recently did like a 25 years jubilee concert, Kasi Kakasi as well. Very interesting, but everyone will remember that song growing up in that era. But becoming, over time, real entrepreneurs doing motivational content, edutainment. And so you notice the shift in how they pronounce it. And nowadays they will use this tagline, we sing for your heart, not for the charts. It's not about pop, but it's hijrah, changing you. Now for me, the quality that you see here is definitely media savviness. Media participation. You don't do Nasyid alone, but you do it with your fans, with your followers, with the people that listen to you. And you ask them to remix your products, to sing your products. And you and I see is the other example here, like doing challenges online through YouTube. And you invite them, we have a new song, please do your version of this particular song. Which is very typical, I would say, of this era. This whole idea that you have like an artist-fan kinship, that you refer to each other as bigger brother. I think something which you newly see here, and definitely part of this kind of media participatory culture, which still is with us, and what is Nasyid is today. And then we're slowly moving into the now. Creativity in the age of AI. And there's this other monster looking at us, and we don't know yet how to handle. And of course, we have the privilege that most of those other technologies we can look in hindsight. You think like, what was the buzz about? What were they panicking? Relax. Now we're looking ourselves at the emergent technology, and we don't know yet how to handle. Like it's a many-headed dragon, you could say, because it has its pros, it has its cons, but we don't know how to handle. It started, of course, out with streaming media, which are already algorithm-based, and you have your AIs already there in your own home, which are great, because for the first time, Spotify, Nasyid can go global. I can be back there in Leiden, in the Netherlands, and downstream a song, listen to in Teams or Ryan or whatever group, if they have their songs, of course, on Spotify, which is a big thing. There's still a big divide in the industry. At the same time, there's people complaining as well, like, first, it's not a big business model, modify. You don't earn anything, and it becomes very much industrialized, very much commodified. There's very little control, you could say. Is this dangerous? Is this scary? Is this risky? Yes and no. I think it also helps in a lot of ways. And I'm myself now working, as Rajesh Kanda was saying, on another project, AI in the world of Islam. And looking at Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia. We are doing one project here in Malaysia on ethical prompting. And ethical prompting is the whole idea, people that are not necessarily ICT literate, that they can't program, they don't code. There's sometimes housewives, teachers, but people who are not in the ICT industry and look at Midjourney, DALI, All those text-to-image generative AI that you have now, what can you do with it? And these things are quickly evolving. Like it started out, for example, people saying like, hey, I want to produce a perfect Islamic image of the Akhirat. And of course, there's a whole ethical discussion. Should you be doing that? You can talk about Hari Kiamat, but should you be visualizing it? Or a jinn or a kuntilanak, the alam gaib. You can also discuss, should you be doing that, but you have the means at least to play around with it. I had a PhD student in Clanton who worked with a man called Muhammad, was producing a very nice Islamic calendar with very modest Islamic image, very pious images. But he was also trying to produce Hang Tuah. He said, what would Hang Tuah look like if he could reproduce him with generative AI? And my colleague was sitting next to him, and the first things that he produced, it looked very Caucasian, very much like white guys like me. And he said, like, no, I want to have something more Malay, like something that looks really like from the kampung. It still very much looked like Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean, as you notice here a little bit. But these things have moved on. You have now people doing this very political Gen AI. All Eyes on Rafa was produced by a housewife in, I think around here, Perak, if I'm not mistaken, but woof, went global. And it proves that ordinary people can appropriate generative AI. And there is a merit to that as well. Which for me is a quality that we can also use in Nasyid. Because yes, it takes away a lot of skills that otherwise certain professions were entitled to, composers, writers, academics like me. And why should I still write books if ChatGPT can write a book? Why should we still be doing that? At the same time, it helps us reflect on what is the real thing? What is authentic? If this is a lacunashi that Bart produced in 20 seconds, it doesn't sound like. But what is the real Nasyid then? And what are we losing? And with other words, like new technologies help us reflect on what is spiritual. Yes, nowadays we can use Midjourney, but let's do it for spiritual things and real proper Sharia-compliant images. So I'm not too negative, and I also think it would help to make Nasyid even a more spiritual genre. So let me wrap up. I realize I talked for long. Maybe you have some questions, but maybe say a little bit about the pros and cons of AI. And we were just talking before we met this morning. There's this new UNESCO report, which may be of interest to some of the music makers here in the room, which is talking about culture as the missing SDG. And there's a lot of sustainable development goals. There's literacy, economy, smart cities. Tapi di mana budaya? And where is culture? So this is an effort to bring culture in. And it contains 2 or 3 chapters on what to do with culture in the era of AI. There are things like copyrights. How do we handle those? Diversity, bias, all those things that we know that are risky if you turn to AI. And so look at the UNESCO website. It's downloadable there for free. It may be helpful. I think it's very nice in summing up both the opportunities and the risks. In the sense that, yes, with Gen AI, everyone can be a musician. Even me, I never studied music. I can do something that vaguely sounds like music. And so it includes people. It also is a means for preserving heritage. I can go through Berita Harian and look everything up about Nasyid in 5 minutes, which I couldn't have done before. And there's tremendous benefits there. But we know that it's very much Anglo-centric. And you learn about Islam, but through a non-Muslim point of view, most of the time, if you use a generative AI. There's a lot of questions about ethics, authorship, copyrights. So it has its downsides, but we are I would say, in a transitional period. In 10 years' time, we will be laughing about it. Like, oh, were we so worried? We will get there, but we should all have a say in this, not leave it to big tech, big companies, but we should have a say in it as well. And so I would say I'm more positive about AI than some other people, fellow academics, musicians, that's in the sense that there's always humans involved. And we are there ourselves. AI can't, they can make music, but they can't believe, they can't intend something. They still need a human to do all of these things. And I rather would see AI as a tool, something that you can jointly collaborate with and produce music. So conclusion, last slide. I would say every technology it comes with its own hopes, its own fears, its own anxieties. And when we first introduced the phonograph, a lot of fear of disembodied voices, as I said. And now my voice is on the record, but where is the person? What happens? Now they can bring me someplace else and sell me, and I don't have any control. Cassettes, when they were first introduced, a very cheap medium. People were laughing about it. And like video CDs, too cheap. I don't want to be on a video CD. These things change. AI, we're all fearing that di mana rohnya. And do we become less spiritual? But again, we have been there. We have had this discussion for over 100 years already. We will cope with it. And so a century of Nasyid, more than a century, I think it also proves that if you were to look at least these 7 technologies, it explains why it is such a great genre. And again, I'm talking here to Nasyid lovers. Don't have to convince you, but Nasyid's most, that's how to say, just most beautiful, commercial, modern, gendered, activist, visual, media savvy, and spiritual of Muslim music. Let's work together on that to keep it that way, I would say. Thank you.
Okay, terima kasih Bart. Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation, and it opens up a lot of new ideas also. It kind of soothes our fears in a way. Okay, kita telah menyaksikan satu penyampaian yang saya rasa sangat informatif, sangat thought provoking lah. Dan ramai pada kita, semalam kita dah discuss tentang AI dan juga masalah pro and cons, dan juga saya rasa the fear of new technologies is normal, dan Pak Bart telah menyenaraikan 7 teknologi daripada zaman sastra Melayu, dengan adanya wujudnya pengaruh-pengaruh kasidah nyanyian, sehinggalah ke era kaset, ke era the first recording 1903, lagu-lagu Melayu, saya rasa lagu Kasim yang nyanyi lagu bangsawan, and then kita move to teknologi band ataupun rakaman suraya, lepas tu kaset, dan juga saya menarik tentang gender, di mana wanita, ke tak perasan tahun 70-an ramai penyanyi-penyanyi nasyid wanita. Dan kemudian kita datang kepada Raihan, tentu Raihan merupakan the turning point dalam evolusi nasyid. Dan yang paling penting sekali tentang AI lah, bagaimana Pak Bart telah menyampaikan, dan buku tu we can get the book di UNESCO, online. Nanti mungkin
if you need help, I'm very much would like to help you and send it to you.
Mungkin lepas ni siapa yang berminat boleh jumpa personally Pak Bart, dan juga buku Sonic Modernities. Buku
boleh juga.
Saya rasa penting buku tu. Okay, saya rasa terima kasih banyak Thank you very much Prof Bart. Berikan tepukan kepada Prof Bart sekali.